Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Scaling Microsoft 365, featuring our special guest, Emily Mancini. My name is Patrick, and I am a sales manager here at Syskit. Here with me is Emily, our star of the day, and my colleague, Carlo, who will be showing you a demo of Syskit Point later on. Many of you already know Syskit as a company, but for those who don't, let me briefly introduce you. Syskit is a software development company founded more than 14 years ago. We develop products for Microsoft 365 and security, as well as for SharePoint on-prem administration. We currently have more than 3,500 customers around the world, ranging from small businesses to large corporations. We currently offer 4 products, including our award-winning SP.doc Kit for SharePoint on-prem, as well as Syskit Point for Microsoft 365 governance. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. All registrants will receive a recording of the webinar within a few days. After the presentation, we will have a short demo of Syskit Point and show you how to empower your users to be more confident in their self-service journey, especially when it comes to gaining deep visibility of their workspaces and keeping data secure and properly governed. After that, we will have a Q&A session where Emily will answer any questions you may have. So please use the Q&A function on the right side of the screen to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you our special guest. Emily Mancini is a lifelong learner and a passionate advocate for seamless user experience, specializing in information architecture and user experience, and is UX Master certified by the Nielsen Norman Group. She is a 3-time recipient of the Microsoft MVP Award for Microsoft 365 apps and services, and a member of the Microsoft 365 Patterns and Practices team. Emily thrives on building accessible structures to help people find what they are looking for and better understand their surroundings. I will now give a warm welcome and turn things over to Emily. Emily, are you ready?
Yes, thank you so much, Patrick. All right, so welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about how to scale up Microsoft 365 environment. And we're going to be primarily exploring one use case where one biotech grew very quickly through exponential growth over the span of 4 years, from 150 people to 1,500. So today what we're going to talk through are first the initial generation of demand in your organization, making sure that what you implement for Microsoft 365 is aligned with what the organization needs. Then we'll start to talk about managing demand as it starts to increase and become challenging for you to control potentially as a team of one, which is what this use case explores. And then we'll talk about scaling the demand and how to expand your team and get some additional support. So starting off with where you're starting the journey in Microsoft 365. As I mentioned, we're going to go on a journey with one fast-growing biotech and some occasional pit stops along the way to talk about different resources to help you on your own journey. My intention with today is we're going to go very quickly over a wide range of resources. So to serve as an introduction for you to be aware of what pieces might be available to add into how you're managing Microsoft 365. So for this biotech, when we started off, we were about 150 people in one office location, and people were not using Microsoft 365 at all. People were primarily managing all work through email, including meeting notes. So for this organization, since we were so meeting heavy, it was very clear that we wanted to start off the journey with implementing OneNote, since that was something that people can be really impactful with their productivity right away. So when you're looking at your organization, try to find that toehold for that initial drive of what is going to provide value to your organization. Microsoft 365 has so many different options and is quite a rich ecosystem of business solutions. So trying to launch everything all at once might cause what I like to call IT whiplash, where it's too much change management for people all at once, instead of focusing on really how we can implement these systems to help people be more productive and put them in context for your colleagues slowly as you start to build in your Microsoft 365 environment. Now, your toehold might be really different depending on your organization. So you really need to be specific about what makes sense for your group. We're going to talk a little bit about user research to help define and find out that information of what your organization really needs. When you start to provide training on it, making sure that you're putting it into context of how it's going to help them be more productive versus, for example, this is OneNote, it's a cloud notebook. Instead, we were talking about this is how OneNote is integrated in Microsoft 365, and you can save time throughout your day. So we went through different use cases like how to take notes more effectively and share them faster with that Outlook integration. So make sure you're also starting to highlight how this is just one solution in a whole suite of tools. So as you start to roll out additional items in Microsoft 365, people understand that as this toolbox grows, because they all work together, it's something that's going to be really beneficial to continue learning and expanding on. So really, the most important question at this stage is, how do I define my business outcomes? What am I trying to achieve with Microsoft 365, where I can identify that toehold? So what are some of the more formal steps that you can take to research? As Patrick mentioned in my introduction, I'm master certified with Nielsen Norman Group, who are the world leaders in user research. So I'm a huge advocate of including some level of user research in every single one of your projects. One of my absolute favorite resources is this grid you can see here on the screen, where Nielsen Norman Group has presented all of the different user research methods on a grid based off of attitudinal versus behavioral and qualitative versus quantitative. So depending on what you are trying to achieve or learn about, this grid can help you determine which study might be the best fit. Most commonly, user interviews are very impactful. This gives you the opportunity to understand what users think, their thoughts and beliefs, those mental models and experiences that they have. So that's really their attitude about whatever you're trying to build into Microsoft 365. For the sake of this use case, I'm going to talk a lot about building intranets in SharePoint, as well as collaboration spaces in Teams and SharePoint sites. So in this stage of the project, we met with a bunch of different individuals to get a good understanding of where they were having challenges. Now, this can be done pretty quickly with a low number of participants, about 6 to 20, and yield a high number of results. Very often, people will skip this face-to-face conversation and instead do surveys. But the challenge with surveys is very likely you're going to get shallow data and you're losing the opportunity to ask more questions and really dig into those interesting paths, which is what you would have the opportunity to do in user interviews. Now, when you're doing those user interviews, to determine when you're done, you'll want to stop receiving new information, and that's called reaching saturation. So let's say you've done 10 interviews and now you're really starting to hear the same feedback from everyone in the organization. This is a good flag that you can stop this user research at this time and start to move forward with action items based off of what you learned in those user interviews. During those user interviews, I highly recommend recording them so that you have some ability to transcribe them, speed up your notes, and always include the team and different stakeholders at any phase in your user research so that you can help build trust in the data, and it also helps them build empathy for the end users who you're building all these solutions for. Typically, in a user interview, we might hear someone say something like, search is really challenging. I can never find content in the intranet. And because that's attitudinal, we might want to look at this grid and go a little bit further and maybe explore something that is behavioral, for example. So maybe we want to go into something like usability testing to measure exactly what's going on in our environment and identify problems. So you can do qualitative usability testing. Essentially, you are providing tasks for people to complete. You're watching how they do it. So you're seeing things that they run into. This way, you're pairing their behavioral data from those interviews, their attitudinal data from their interviews with their behavioral data in that usability testing. So you can also see if how they think they feel about the intranet, for example, is actually the experience that they're having. This is also something that you should explore testing under realistic conditions. So that way, for example, if you have an open air office and people are trying to complete a complex business process on your intranet, making sure that you're not putting them in a quiet room and changing their environment to measure it. Or for example, if people are maybe a field team and they access all of this on tablets, you want to make sure that you're doing usability testing in those conditions as well. There's so much more we can talk about with user research and how to do these more effectively. Just want to introduce these as options because it's really important that if we're going to be keeping people at the center of Microsoft 365 and focusing on that employee experience, the only real way for us to know what their experience is to spend the time listening to them and watching their experiences. Now, typically at this point of generating demand and looking into Microsoft 365, some organizations may not even know what is possible or what is available. You might have a subscription to Microsoft 365 and know there's a lot that I can do, and I know I'm not doing all of it, but I'm not even sure what's out there. I highly recommend exploring this resource for your team, the maturity model for Microsoft 365. Essentially, it is a framework to create socialization across the IT team and the rest of the organization. So the capabilities of Microsoft 365 are broken out into the different competencies that you can see. For example, we have collaboration, communication, staff and training, search. And through those different competencies, they are broken down into levels of maturity. So starting at the 100 level, you have an experience where things are a little bit more exploratory, ad hoc. This might be where a lot of people are starting their Microsoft 365 journey. And then as we look up the different maturity levels, we can see in the descriptions the impacts that we're going to experience. Now, going to the 500 level is not a requirement for all organizations and arguably not for most. We tend to see most organizations be able to really successfully work within Microsoft 365 at that 300 level defined and standardized level. As you go through the different articles for the maturity model for Microsoft 365 and you read through those different levels, let's say you are reading through communication, for example. Maybe you determine that your organization does need to be a much more mature level for communication, but when it comes to customization and develop, maybe you don't have a lot of needs there because the out-of-the-box tools are really getting your business outcomes. So you can use this as a tool to determine where you want to head, where you want to implement those different toeholds, and what is actually possible in this environment. There's also a monthly meetup for the maturity model practitioners if you want to get a little bit more involved in this initiative, to have presentations about the different competencies, provide feedback on them, or ask questions. So as you are trying to identify your business outcomes to generate demand in your initial implementation of Microsoft 365, make sure you're conducting that user research so you're connecting directly with the employees who you're trying to help serve. And then you can also start to do things like benchmarking the organization with the maturity model for Microsoft 365 to identify where you are now and where you might want to grow. Now, all of that is a lot of work that I'm sure you're all going through, and you're coming to this webinar to talk more about, okay, we've done that. Now we have a lot of demand in our environment, but we don't have enough people to support it. What can we do to keep ensuring that the adoption is strong on Microsoft 365 because the support is stellar and we're providing needs to the business to support top tasks, business outcome objectives that are aligning with our company goals? Since we only have 1 hour, we're skipping ahead to there being tons of demand, and we're going to specifically talk about SharePoint sites for collaboration and communication. So at this point at the biotech, people are beginning to use Microsoft 365. They see that it is incredibly useful, but as we're gaining adoption, we're still a team of one. And it's not scalable to be able to help all of these people as we're growing in that 4x exponential growth over a few years from one office now to multiple offices across the world. So we don't even have that face-to-face in-person connection that we used to have. So a lot of what we did will have to shift. Originally, we were first come, first served, and we were able to provide really high-level white glove service. As the demand grows, We are risking not prioritizing in the same way. We're risking reducing our customer service, and we need a little bit more guidance from the business in conjunction with IT. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we start to manage that demand. Now, one of the first things that we shifted at this stage of scaling is we didn't have the budget for more business analysts or developers, but we knew the solo resource who was serving that business analyst and project management role couldn't also be the person who was continually interrupted by break fix. So we were able to bring in a managed services company at this time. We had trusted relationships across the organization when it came to SharePoint, and as being a solo resource for so many people led to interrupt-driven days and questions across bathroom stalls. When you are one source of information and you don't have it available any other way, it makes it very hard for you to keep your day manageable. So this has clearly become something that's unsustainable. How do I continue supporting this platform with white glove service while keeping those trusted relationships? So as I mentioned, this is the part where we brought in managed services to help support our tickets. Now, as we're expanding our platform and our team, it's important to realize that we're not just talking about how Microsoft 365 can be helpful and create that employee experience. We're expanding a little bit out of that, and we're really talking about the customer experience. It's kind of like ordering food online. If the website is frustrating, it's actually going to impact my experience of how delicious that food was. So if the support around Microsoft 365 is challenging, it's going to color my experience at what it's like using those tools. So let's look at two options to keep an eye on that customer journey and make sure you're watching what that end user experience is like as you are decentralizing that support from just yourself and having all of that data. One of my favorite tools is to look at a customer journey. Now, this is something that happened very often when we were at the biotech back in the days of where the sync was a little bit more challenging. We ran into a lot of SharePoint co-authoring errors. So there was a lot of negative stigma around co-authoring in SharePoint Online due to that. And we wanted to look a little bit more about why this was such a hard experience. So we created a customer journey map. So what we're seeing on the screen, across the middle, we have a baseline. So that is neutral feelings. Above is positive, below is negative, and then we have our different touch points along the bottom. So as we're going through this journey, we have our end user navigating to SharePoint. They know where it is, they were well trained, the navigation is intuitive, that was easy. They were able to find their document to open and begin editing. We have a strong information architecture. We're using site columns and content types to present the right information at the right time. So getting into SharePoint to work on the content has all been great. But at this point, we encounter an error. So we drop below that neutral and feel a little bit negative for the first time. Now, the error is a little bit annoying, but what's really frustrating is now I have to go outside of SharePoint to navigate to my ticket system. Now I have to put in this ticket. You see my experience is going lower and lower. And we can see now we're coming to coordinate time to troubleshoot. It continues to get lower. So we see experiencing the error to getting the help is really where the problem is. It's not necessarily something that we have the capacity to fix in SharePoint. For example, this co-authoring error was something that was outside of our control at the time. Now, when we did meet to troubleshoot with this end user, their experience improved, but at the end of the ticket closure, their experience is still ultimately negative. So now they have this negative perception of SharePoint, and it might color their willingness to go back in the future. Something that we can look at past that customer journey, which you can see we have in here a row across the top, is what we call a service map. So the added data that we have here is we have the time points of how much time went by across all of these different interactions. We have the different pieces of evidence that we can look at. And then we have the lines of interaction. And this is what's really important. The customer is on the other side of the line of interaction, and what they can see, right, is their ability to go input that ticket. What they don't have visibility to is all of this other information. How many people are coming to the site, any kind of errors in our message center, for example, any back-end support, where they are in the queue. And what we saw is that really where the time point was over here, 3 days. This coordinating time to troubleshoot took so long that this tiny error that someone had has really interrupted their entire week. And that's why there's this negative experience of SharePoint. So I just want to flag here that as you are removing yourself from those direct touch points, you never want to stop evaluating this and making sure that you are looking past that line of visibility for your end users and evaluating the back end support to provide a positive customer experience from the beginning to the end of the solution, not just the technical pieces that you implement. Another piece of support that we wanted to provide at this stage, again, to provide more self-service or entry points for people and remove and reduce that reliance on one person for any information about Microsoft 365, was we went to the lookbook and we installed a free open source solution called Microsoft 365 Learning Pathways. Now, what Microsoft Learning Pathways does is it actually installs a site collection into your environment. It also comes with a web part. That site collection has a lot of content from support.microsoft.com on what to click and how to interact and navigate all of these different Microsoft 365 solutions. So now you don't need to document all that information and it's automatically updated by Microsoft. Additionally, because you get a web part, you can now take that web part and put it in context on other sites. So you can reduce the friction of people needing to find that help content in the places where they're already working. So it's available to them at the right time. Another thing that you can do within Learning Pathways as well is you can add in any of your own SharePoint pages, so you can document any of the nuanced governance or information about how you are working in your environment and make that available to the rest of your organization. You can even intermingle your custom content with that external content. So this can become a really powerful tool to use to document any of that training or guidance on how to work within Microsoft 365. Just a quick little preview of what Learning Pathways looks like. This is what it looks like right out of the box as you get it installed in your environment. As you can see, we're scrolling down here. This is all of the content that we get from Microsoft. We're navigating into a playlist where you can see we're ingesting that support.microsoft.com content within our SharePoint environment, and we haven't even had to leave it. We have the ability to go forward and backwards in a linear path, or use that playlist to skip ahead to just the step that I forgot in a process. So I'm supporting both brand new users and returning users by giving the capability to see the content those different ways. Just to show you a little area in the back end of Learning Pathways to show you how easy it is to pull together these different playlists. We can add them in. You can even control and hide or remove content that was brought in from Microsoft. So if you're not using Viva Engage, for example, you could hide that so it's not presented in this site. So I highly recommend exploring this and putting your custom content in here. So as we're expanding our support, we're trying to make sure we're keeping that seamless customer experience by focusing on that consistency across the touch points, making sure that managed service team can support just as well as we did as one internal person. We're ensuring that we're still building those relationships with all of our different colleagues by having these conversations of what they need, providing that business analyst support and making sure that's the time that we're available for. We've also started to build some compassion for that end user experience by using things like the customer journey map to share with our colleagues to show what their experience is compared to maybe what their experience is as the support person who is incredibly busy and may not realize how much of an impact that 3-day delay to coordinate time with that end user really caused. And then we also want to create asynchronous learning opportunities. So as people want to opt in and see that information independently, they can. Now at this point, we have now created some more available time for our solo resource by having those asynchronous learning opportunities as well as that break fix support. So this is the stage where we actually started to establish our governance. And I will say the big lesson learned was do it sooner. We had very small organic growth that exploded. We've seen how much that's happened to a lot of different organizations as they switched to teams to go virtual and hybrid during the pandemic. So a lot of people are now actually doing this as governance a little bit later after people are already working within the system. It may be a little bit more challenging, but it's never too late. Governance can be this big, scary concept, which is often why people don't address it early on, but you can keep it simple, a lowercase g governance to start. As we have in this image, think about it as bumpers in a bowling alley. You're not necessarily setting it up so someone gets a strike or a spare every single time, but you are making sure that we don't lose that ball in the gutter and we're at least guiding them to the correct path. This is something that you can also scale with your environment as you start to grow. So if you begin with just collaborating in teams, for example, maybe your governance will just speak about that. And then you'll expand your governance as you add in intranet and communication sites, and those needs are inherently different than those collaboration spaces. The top resource I recommend for getting started with your governance is Susan Hanley's Governance Policies and Questions Guidelines. She is another thought leader in our community and Microsoft MVP. This is a very, very extensive deck that covers absolutely every edge that you would need to answer. So you might be exploring only a subset of them in the beginning, but this really will walk you and your team through all of the edges that you should be considering. Now, as you do this, I do recommend that you create a small team. Start thinking about your intranet steering committee, who we're going to be bringing up a little bit later. This might be the group that you're having these governance conversations with. It might be a little bit bigger, where you're ensuring that you're including some cross-functional thought leaders or department heads as well, to ensure you're aligning the solutions with what they want to implement next year. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about scaling demand as well. So as you create your governance plan, focus on asking lots and lots of questions. Use that deck to connect with everyone, to ask all those different questions of what they're trying to do. As we talked about in the beginning, we're trying to align the solutions in Microsoft 365 with your business outcome objectives. So what is the business trying to achieve? And the only way for us to find that out is through all of those conversations and interviews. Once you start to create that governance, you want to make sure that you socialize it so people in the organization are aware of it. I highly recommend using learning pathways, those playlists, and putting the subset of governance in context where it applies to reduce that friction of people trying to find the content. Don't make these big, giant, heavy books, dictionaries, encyclopedias of governance. Try to make them actionable ways of working, short videos, things that are consumable on a task basis to ensure that people will actually look at it and follow it. Once you establish your governance, you might also need to meet with other groups in the organization to talk about how to measure it. So we met with our security team at this phase, and we talked about what we need to audit to support our parameters. We decided as a team that site sprawl actually wasn't the issue. We're okay with there being lots of sites as long as they're in use and meeting specific needs. What we were more concerned about was the misuse of sites, or if sites are unused. Our security team was specifically also concerned about external access and making sure that we remove that when those relationships end. So this is what we came up with for the high level of auditing that we wanted to do across the sites and start to build into some type of automation dashboards and reports. What we did at this phase was create custom solutions from the audit log to feed into Power BI. There's tons of different ways to go about this depending on what you want to audit. So after we implemented that auditing, we also realized that we can provide guide rails for our different people in the organization by also creating some templates. Templates can not only support getting the content built faster, but it can also ensure that we are following that process every single time and not adding in human error and missing steps. Very quick, high-level introduction to Microsoft 365 template options, just because as you explore this as a team of one, if you are not familiar with custom code, I want to flag to you that you will need to explore third-party tools if you want to do page templates. So essentially, page templates are not available across site collections. So if I wanted a homepage template for everything on my intranet, I could either manually create that per site. I could use a third-party migration tool to copy the page from site to site. I could use a third-party template tool to save my templates in so I don't have to do code. Or I could use PNP provisioning templates, and that would require XML and PowerShell. So you might need to consider an implementation partner if that's outside your comfort zone. Templating supports a couple of different things. We talked about how it supports that governance plan by putting those edges in. I love putting into templates the actual guidance of what you want people to do on each page as well. That way, when someone builds the page, they don't need to go to an additional place to go find out how to do it. They're actually just there in context of the page. They can delete out the instructions, put in their content. Templating also supports the concept of leveraging your visual hierarchy for consistency. So visual hierarchy is what is going to draw your eye and attention on the page. So making sure that we are consistently drawing people's attention to the correct place across all of our different sites is really important, and something we can build into that template by using different things like the section backgrounds, section sizes, or web parts. It also helps support your brand identity as you define better practices and build that into the template. For example, maybe you have sentence case, you pre-build that all into the navigation. And again, it reduces that IT burden. We're talking about being that team of one. So where are the ways that we can shave off time? So if it's a half hour every time we're making a new intranet site that is now a template, then that really does add up throughout the day. We've talked so far about ways to expand that IT team and different tools to support that group. But what about expanding outside of just that formal IT team? Very often when we're talking about Microsoft 365 and intranets, IT isn't the only owner. We also want to make sure that we have owners very common from communications or marketing, because they are going to be the owners of the content, while IT is there to support the technical side and the guidance there. And it really is a partnership between the two. As we're looking at this partnering and development across those two departments, also consider how you can partner in development across the entire organization. If you offer self-service to your organization, essentially you're expanding your team and collaborating across the organization to empower these different department team members to run independently as well. Because we were a one-person team at this point and we had declined additional budget requests and we had a really long list of site requests, if we don't solve this problem, our end users are going to go elsewhere. Users are like water, they flow in the direction of least resistance. So think again about that customer experience I was talking about. This moment is still part of it. If someone's waiting on a really long queue to get support, they might go to another solution that's free and available on the internet right now, like maybe the Google Suite. And now our intellectual property at a biotech is outside of our audit scope. So it's incredibly important that we keep our timeliness and that positive customer experience. So what we did as a group is reviewed the needs in the project queue. We started to have conversations around trends that we saw in current needs. We identified what was low audience and therefore low risk. So how can we get out of their way? What low-hanging fruit can we start to empower people to do maybe a little bit more independently? As a growing organization with multiple regions and changing needs very quickly, continually changing subject matter expertise and roles and responsibilities, we determined that our communication sites and therefore our intranet sites had really high user experience needs. So those are something that we're going to keep building in collaboration, and we were going to shift team sites and those simple collaboration needs to self-service so we could start to increase the technical literacy of the business. So at this point, we started to implement training and long-term support. At this phase, we did a beta test of training for these sites to make sure, again, we're understanding what those business outcome objectives are, and the training is covering what people are trying to build. So we had the opportunity to beta test and iterate that training before we launched it to the company. We also provided that long-term support of the documentation of the training in our Learning Pathways site so people can independently find it after that training. Last but not least, we also added a monthly meetup. As you're expanding this team, they're going to have questions, run into new issues, and potentially have some challenges with change management and need a little bit of support and guidance from you who has more seasoned experience with IT change management. It can be really frustrating when you're trying to implement systems for the first time with a team and you're not used to supporting them and helping them navigate shifting your ways of working to that. So you can be a source of support in teaching them some of those business analyst skills as well. This also becomes your group for feedback on strategy. You have a monthly group of champions who are all actively using this software. They know their edge cases and they know their needs. As Microsoft 365 inevitably announces new capabilities, you can bring it to this group and talk through it with them and beta test before you launch to the rest of the company. So this starts to become a tiering of how you're sharing information and testing it out before you launch it. As you launch this self-service, we made a one-pager. So it's very quick and scannable of what the parameters are, of what you can do independently. So you can see here, people can make team sites. The site owner needs to be an active member of that team or project so they understand the needs. We had different site permission guidelines, different document library guidelines, and then you can see at the bottom we're clearly calling out when they hit a level of complexity where it makes sense to work together. This was very early days, so we hadn't created training yet around Microsoft lists, better practices with content type hub, content types and site columns. So that's something that we wanted to have be part of our conversation. As I mentioned earlier, you can create the Learning Pathways playlist. You can use the web part to put just that subset of content in context. So we created a site for our SharePoint champions. Here you can see we have news, upcoming trainings, but right here in the middle of the screen is where I have that subset of Learning Pathways content for self-service site build guidelines. I'm intermingling the specific content for our organization with the content from Microsoft. We also have community space for people to share their achievements as we have Viva Engage embedded on that homepage. So make sure you create a space for them to interact with each other as well and put all of the training content in context to make it easy for them to access. Now, you might have some really ambitious site owners, and instead of putting that governance on them and extinguishing that flame potentially, I highly recommend instead showing them that they can have a developer tenant, giving them a sandbox and letting them create whatever they want in that space so they can demonstrate and talk through items with you, and you can provide that better practice before it gets added to your environment. You can feel safe that they are working in an entirely different tenant that doesn't touch yours. Now, you'll want to be thoughtful because these dev tenants are going to be owned independently, so you'll want to provide guidance on not putting confidential company information in there, as it'll be outside of your scope for audits and access. So as you explore launching self-service, focus on identifying that self-service scope. What can you support at your organization? What makes sense to empower other people to do and not do in partnership with IT? Make sure you're still partnering in that site development where it's really important and you can have a strong value add, and create that long-term support for people to access. At this point, now we have created the opportunity for self-service, and we have a bunch of excited individual contributors. The way we can best support those individual contributors is to now raise awareness with the managers on our extended leadership team on what the project queue is and our constraints in the budget, why we're choosing self-service, and how this self-service is going to help them meet their goals faster. What's really important in this conversation is also to highlight expectations around the work involved in self-service. It's not a one-time someone made a site and now they're done and they can work here for the next 10 years. Microsoft 365 will change, the group's needs will change, and inherently your site and collaboration spaces and communication spaces in SharePoint are living, breathing objects that need continual maintenance. So I highly recommend working with managers to start getting this built into job descriptions. Otherwise, what we've seen happen is the individual contributors are excited in the beginning and active content is fresh and new. Time passes, they get busy, the manager doesn't prioritize their work on the intranet, and the content becomes stale, and we have to do a giant rework project, which is very costly for the business. Some examples of roles and responsibilities that we have. We do this not only to support those individual contributors with their managers, but also to set expectations of the support that people are providing from IT. So for example, the SharePoint admin is guiding the information architecture, security, and governance of the environment. They're assisting in the more complicated web part app and business process automation creation. They're also responsible for supporting the site owners and site members. It was really important that we called out the site owners. If you're doing independent self-service, they need to come to our training every 18 months as things shift, and they're responsible for monitoring that content in their environment and providing access to their new employees, teaching the better practice to their site members, since that's specific to what their team is doing. And then, of course, we wanted to add in accountability on our site members as well. For someone who is using these sites, it's also their responsibility to follow those best practices and actively engage in the site and report any issues when they run into it, not just stop using it, abandon it, and follow a new process. Now, as we've created this support with the managers, we also want to make sure that we highlight what these individual contributors and new self-service site owners are doing to the rest of the organization, not only to highlight and elevate them and thank them very publicly for expanding their areas of expertise and learning something new that might be a little bit uncomfortable and unfamiliar, but also as an opportunity to highlight the return on investment of taking time to learn how to use these systems and how it benefits their department and the business outcome objectives they're trying to achieve. Not only are you thanking these individual contributors, they are your absolute best marketing to the rest of the organization of wanting to learn Microsoft 365 and independently start to build in it. We would put case studies in our newsletters. We would have presentations of these different case studies and successes at company and department meetings. And last but not least, we also gave out swag. We had enamel pins anytime someone became a certified site owner after going through that self-service training. So that way they could display their achievements. So there's a couple different things you'll want to think about to support that self-service. Focus on aligning goals with the business, communicating expectations to leaders, and celebrating those site owners' successes. Now, at this point, we're chatting with functional leaders, but how do we handle conflicts for strategy, bandwidth, and prioritizing? All the requests that we're getting in the list, they're not IT initiatives. So this is a culture shift for this company platform. Originally, it was led by IT as we implemented, but now we really want to bring in other people to provide guidance on these different projects and how they should be prioritized. Because for me, as a manager of the platform of Microsoft 365, I don't have access to the nuance and details of those higher level projects. So what we established was a steering committee. We brought in people from different functions and different regions with authority, and this was a really important part of the conversation. We needed to have the people in the room where we could have an active conversation and make decisions in those hour-long sessions. They needed to provide company-level perspectives and endorsements on the projects. So to invite to the steering committee, what we first did was sent an email. We defined the expectations, goals, and the risk to status quo of if we don't have this monthly meeting or bi-monthly meeting, then these are the challenges that we're going to experience. Communication and collaboration was a top company level goal as we were growing so quickly and expanding. So the leaders fully understood this is important. And we used our first meeting to define what success would be. Now, for many people, that's not enough to get your leaders in the room. executives are incredibly busy with competing priorities. One of the tools you might want to use to show them the size of the bread box that we're talking about, size and scale of the content in Microsoft 365, is the Power BI content pack. This will give quantitative data of how much is there in the environment. You'll also want to pair with this some qualitative data, so those wins and positive anecdotes for the return on investment for how groups are working better together. You'll also want to explain to them that you're managing a growing environment. I like to use the farmer and field analogy. When you are farming, you don't just plant the seed and then you're done. You have to water, hoe, weed, you have to harvest the fruit, you have to then treat the soil again, and there's a whole process year over year. The same is true for these sites. So it's not, I stood up the site and I'm done with that project forever. There's continued maintenance and needs. So as we plant more fields, we have more work that we're going to have to do. So what we did in these meetings is highlight what was on the project queue and explain it to them. One of the ways that we did this was put them into need statements. So we talked about who had the need, what it was, and what they were going to be able to accomplish for each project. This might be a conversation I have one-on-one if I have clarifying questions before I bring it to the steering committee. We then took all of those different items and paired them to company goals. So it was my best guess of which of our public company goals this would match. Then the steering committee would take that and we would talk through an effort to impact matrix. So I would talk about which projects were high effort versus low effort. They would give me the data on what is low impact versus high impact. We would put onto this grid and we would publicly share that when we talked about our project prioritization. We had a lot of transparency in this conversation. So when you're establishing that steering committee, focus on increasing that visibility into that Microsoft 365 metrics of how big it is and what's in that project queue. Do the work of aligning those Microsoft 365 needs with the business and culture goals as a first pass to help put into context for the steering committee, since they don't necessarily always understand the return on investment of implementing these solutions. And then, of course, make sure you highlight that risk of keeping it status quo. At this point, we're now heading into talking about moving from reactive to proactive. Everything we've gotten so far is people are requesting to us. Now I recommend, now that we have our steering committee, we know budgets happen at a certain time of year. And I know all of these leaders who love Microsoft 365 are coming up with things they need to achieve next year, but they're not necessarily telling me. And there's very likely things that we need to build in Microsoft 365 to support those business outcome objectives. So I recommend proactively reaching out to all of these different leaders and departments, asking for a meeting to talk about their goals that they're setting for next year, so you can build into your budget some support for them or have combination of budget, so IT isn't shouldering the entire cost. Now, the risk of not having these conversations, when you're only reactive, you're missing the opportunity to get ahead and be a little bit more thoughtful and strategic about your enterprise architecture. You're also potentially getting stuck in silo solutioning or repetitive, redundant tasks as you're not identifying some common needs that you can group together. You might even be getting some technical debt as you make different decisions down the line. For task management, for example, maybe you started with to-do and later you decide you need a custom SharePoint list. Now we have to move everybody off it. But if we had paired all the task management conversations together at the same time, we could have made a more thoughtful choice for the company. So align those goals with the functional leaders and make sure you get ahead of those inevitable requests. What you can then create is a roadmap to share out with the business so they also understand when they are asking for these ad hoc projects that aren't on this roadmap, that there's potentially going to be a delay and that there is benefit to aligning goals and being more strategic and getting involved at that higher level in advance of their immediate need. So they can help support you as well in your ability to be more proactive by reaching out to you in the beginning when they think they have a project coming. So I recommend establishing that strategic plan by focusing on those enterprise level solutions, knitting together the different projects to take it to a higher strategic way of implementing. align on goals with the functional leaders, and be very transparent about what you're going to work on. Now, I know this was an incredibly fast ride through going from a solo resource to now developing a champions network where we might have training and site templates. We've established department allies where we're aligning budgets and we are talking about governance. And we've also implemented a steering committee so that we have a prioritization matrix for our projects and a strategic plan to help guide us. Thank you all so much. I know this was a high-level introduction, so I have all of the different resources here for you to expand your learning a little bit more, and I'm always happy to continue the conversation with you. And with that, I would like to turn it back to the Syskit team for our Syskit Point demo.
All right, thank you very much, Emily. This was an awesome presentation. So yeah, just a kind of reminder to everyone, if you have any questions for Emily, submit them for our Q&A session later on. So please don't be shy. But before that, we are going to give our presenter a break and turn things over to Carlo from Syskit. He will do a quick demo on how Syskit Point can empower your users to be more confident in their self-service journey, especially when it comes to gaining deep visibility of their workspaces. Carlo, are you ready?
Yes, everything's ready. You should be able to see my screen, Patrick, right?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Patrick said, my name is Carlo and I'm one of the customer success managers here at Syskit. And to immediately dive into it, just as a reminder for all of you, Syskit Point is our integrated and scalable platform that makes M365 end-to-end management and governance easier, not just for you, but also for your business users. And we've seen the importance of doing exactly that, extending that empowerment today from this lovely presentation. So Syskit Point provides your central IT and security teams with full visibility across your tenant down to the file level, as well as the ability to stay proactive about your security and compliance practices. And then finally, through our collaborative governance, it allows you to empower your end users to participate in the proper usage and governance of M365. So oftentimes when I do speak to our customers that find themselves in these situations that we heard about today, I see on one end a clear business need to offload the central IT and security teams, right, from those operational day-to-day tasks, but also long-term to optimize and scale the digital workplace experience. On the other hand, we also see a lot of hesitation to quote unquote lose control from that central team, lose any potential detailed insight into your daily activity on your tenant. Today, I want to show you that process can and has to be a gradual one, kind of what we've seen today, right? Where your central teams can feel fully in control while still delegating some of that daily work and empowering those relevant business users, meaning team owners, site owners, whatever they may be. I've divided it today into four boxes, but really three phases, where the first two will be talking about the self-service workspace center as kind of the first level of empowerment and exposure. Then the second one will be the task automation, or essentially the delegation of the basic workspace maintenance. And then the final kind of delegated management through the full-on collaborative governance. Okay, so as our first step, let's talk about how do we even establish this self-service workspace center. The primary goal there is to ensure that everyone in my environment, number one, has the appropriate and timely access to the resources they need, but also that they have the ability to create a functional, secure, and an automatically compliant and governed resource, right? So for that, we've created the ability to essentially form a centralized inventory within the Syskit Point add-on that in this case sits in the MS Teams app, where let's imagine a scenario where I'm Cork Blanc, I'm a new marketing colleague, and I'm trying to find all the relevant security groups, teams, M365 groups, whatever it may be. And I don't want to create new ones if I have something at my disposal. This centralized inventory that Syskit Point enables you to have immediately will show me the relevant workspaces that I might need to join. So for example, here, I notice that I'm not part of the product marketing manager's team, and I can simply ask to join this team. I can specify the reason, right? And I can submit this request to the other end, right? Okay. Now, this request will essentially go through an approval process that can be integrated into your help desk ticketing kind of system, right? Okay, but let's say that Cork wants to create an after-work resource where he wants to bond with the colleagues. He wants to create some sort of a space that's going to empower him to do that. As we've seen today, we want to encourage that, but we also want to ensure that this is done in a very controlled and safe way. Through the Syskit Point provisioning, our users, through this request workspace command, will be exposed only to the templates that we've pre-created and ensured for them, right? So I will choose that I want a type of resource of Microsoft Teams and that I want a public team. What I will be then prompted to do is just enter some basic information, right? Add my owners, add my members, and then all the stuff that we did in the background with Syskit Point will ensure that this gets created in a safe and governed way, right? We will select request team and it will be sent to the relevant person on the other side. Here in Syskit Point, I can see all of the requests that I've sent that have been either resolved or that are still active. So I get full visibility as a business user, but also on the other end, the central team knows that there's a strategic system in place. Okay. We can take it a step further and essentially go to that second step of adding an additional level of empowerment to our business users by providing them with the ability to perform basic workspace maintenance. So your end users, as we know, are at the source of the relevant information. So we want to enable that various policies will reach out to your business users and help them navigate through issues such as minimum or maximum ownership of their workspaces, any sort of guest user recertification, orphaned resources, lifecycle management, right? If we have inactive content, we either want to use it, utilize it, or get rid of it. What that will look like is essentially in your teams, your business users will get some sort of a notification. For example, this Project Mercury team is not being used, and it will tell me the following team has been inactive for X amount of days, and what would you like to do? Do I keep it? Do I archive it or delete it? This way, we are already including the people that are relevant, that are closer to the source of information, right? The final step that goes even beyond this kind of basic maintenance of workspaces is the full collaborative governance. And there we're talking really about giving and handing over a lot of the central power to those team owners that we talked about today in both of the presentations, right? So right now we're in Cork's Syskit Point dashboard where he immediately sees his entire inventory. He sees already some actionable intelligence right here, such as his inactive resources, such as his sites that are shared in some way that might not be desirable, right? So hopefully this kind of demonstrated that this process of empowering your business user has to be a gradual one. We understand that this doesn't happen overnight, and that's why we're here to also help you and tailor some of these things to the needs of your organization and roll it out gradually. To not just leave this as a presentation, I really truly encourage you to go to our website and try out our free trial, 21-day free trial. Reach out to our team if you need any help, and we will see how this entire process fits into the needs of your scaling, growing organization. So that would be it from me. I would love to hear some questions for myself, for our presenter today, Emily. Just please let us know if you're interested in any of the content presented.
Thank you, Carlo, for the great demo. Now it's time for our Q&A session with Emily and Carlo. So yeah, Emily, are you ready for some questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And
Okay,
I will
so
say, I wish I had Syskit Point back in the day when I was doing this platform management with this biotech. It would have been so helpful for our auditing, absolutely, management of it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so first question we have is from Julia. So thanks for the question. So she asked about the maturity model. So is the maturity model like a project management team?
So the maturity model is based off of the capability maturity model. So it's a source of articles that you can use to socialize. So I would recommend using it within project teams, but that's not the only audience. They're truly written so that anyone in the business, whether you're inside or outside of IT, would be able to understand the impacts of implementing Microsoft 365 solutions. So really understanding that benefit of what it is and talking through the business outcome objectives, less the technical capabilities.
Okay, thanks, Emily. We also have a second question from Julia. I believe that, Carlo, you can help us with this one. Was throughout the demo. The question is, can there be a guest user in these workspaces? I want to be able to create a shared space for our membership.
Could we get some clarification? Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. So I believe she's asking if whenever there is provisioning, if there would be a guest user in those workspaces, because she wants to create kind of a shared space for their membership.
So the guest users can definitely be part of it, and for example, after even creating such a space, through our continued governance, you can, as a team owner, regularly recertify these guest users, control their permissions down to the file level, right? You have a lot of control and visibility in terms of these guest users. Like I said, it can be done through the content side of things, right? Through the content level of what's being shared with whom, or you can kind of go from the angle of all the guest users that are present and decide whether you want them to be part of those resources or not. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Carlo. Conscious of the time, maybe just a last question for you, Emily. How do I determine how much time my company will need to allocate for the end user research? If you could help us with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said in the beginning, I do strongly advocate for user research at some level for every single project. And I really do mean that. So when I do a site build, for example, we write out those user needs statements. So you can have a department representative in that situation. Let's say we're building one site, we'll go through that exercise and represent the users. That's not directly connected to them, but I would say from the smallest scale, try to make it proportional to your project, 10 to 20% of your budget and time. So if I'm building a site and it's going to be about 10 hours for me to spend 1 to 2 hours having these conversations, defining it, ensuring that we can measure it at the end, will make, especially if you do usability testing, you find 85% of your errors with just 5 people. So if you can, I would say build in interviews and usability testing as much as you can. So 40-hour project, maybe you're doing 5 to 10 hours.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. All right, I think we are ready to wrap the meeting. So yeah, Emily, any additional words that you want to do before we end?
Just thank you so much for having me here with you. Self-service is something that I strongly believe in, and I'm very grateful that Syskit is making solutions for us so we can manage that well.
Thank you very much, Emily. All right, once again, thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. As mentioned, everyone who registered for this event will receive a recording of the webinar. Thanks again to our special guest, Emily Mancini, for joining us today and giving a great presentation. It was a pleasure having you all with us. Yeah, so if you have any further questions regarding Syskit Point or any of our products, please reach out to us at sales@syskit.com. Again, it was a pleasure having you all. See you next time.